Welcome folks, welcome to another video. Today we'll discuss about application versus API gateway. There's a big showdown, right? Before we talk about the agenda, if you have already subscribed to the channel, if not, go ahead and subscribe, like the video, comment. If you have any topics that you wanted me to cover, go ahead and put a comment there. I will answer your queries. So coming to today's agenda, we'll discuss about what does application load balancer do, what does an API gateway do, the face off between the both and the use cases, what to use when. So what does an application load balancer do? Application load balancer automatically distributes incoming HTTPS traffic to backend services like EC2 containers. So application sends a request to the ALB. We can configure different routes in the ALB like slash delete, slash get, slash insert, which will be distributed to the target groups with AWS Lambda or application servers on EC2 in the backend. Right? API Gateway is a fully managed and serverless API service from AWS. Automatically scales up and down. Infrastructure is managed by AWS and it's highly available and elastic. Usage wise, it looks similar. We'll get into the details of it when we see the exact differences. Right? Let's move on. So the big face off now, ALB versus API Gateway. Who is going to win? Let's start. So load balancing for microservices and web apps is done by ALB. API Gateway does API management, request transformation, throttling. ALB operates at layer 7, HTTP and HTTPS. API Gateway is similar to ALB but with more API specific features. ALB cannot do rate limiting, right? It doesn't have rate limiting and bursting capability, whereas API Gateway can implement rate limiting and bursting for APIs. So what does this mean? One particular client can call only 100,000 times a month. At a point in time, we should allow only 10,000 requests for that particular client. So what does this say? A rate limiting is 100,000 here per month for that particular client, where at a point in time, we are allowing the burst limit of 10,000 requests for that client. So all these settings are possible within the API gateway, but not on application load balancer. There's not any difference, but both can integrate with web application firewall. The next difference is ALB cannot do request validation, request response mapping, and other things similar to that, whereas API Gateway can do request validation, request response mapping. So, what does this mean? If you are expecting a field, example an invoice ID, and if it's not present, API Gateway can reject it. No need to go to the backend to perform these checks. Similarly, for a request response mapping, if a specific field is coming, you want to map it to a different field before sending it to the backend. So that also can be done by API Gateway. So for example, the client is sending something called a client ID, whereas the backend understands it as company ID. API Gateway can perform this mapping before forwarding the request to backend for processing. Hope it's clear. ALB can handle HTTP and HTTPS traffic, whereas API Gateway is HTTPS traffic only. Application load balancer delays can be seen during spiky traffic. You need to pre-allocate LCUs to avoid delay, which results in extra charge. Whereas API Gateway can handle spiky traffic with the default 10,000 RPS and 5,000 concurrent requests, right? That's burst traffic. So what does this mean? API Gateway can handle the burst traffic and spiky traffic much better, whereas for ALB, you need to pre-allocate underlying EC2s to avoid any delays. However, you have to pay extra for this as you are keeping things warm here. Moving on. ALB is a regional service, whereas API Gateway can integrate with Lambda EC2s from a different region, even from a different AWS account. ALB can integrate with any OIDC compliant IDP, that's Cognito, LDAP, etc. Whereas API Gateway have extensive authorization and authentication integration like API Key, IAM, Cognito User Pool, Cognito Identity Pool, and external IDP. So ALB, doesn't have this integration with API key. It's actually API concept, right? So this OIDC actually is a identity authentication protocol that is an extension of open authorization, right? OAuth 2.0 to standardize the process for authenticating and authorizing users when they sign in to access digital services. So here API Gateway can provide an extensive mechanism for this, right? Whereas ALB provides a standard mechanism. Caching of responses is not possible on ALB, whereas caching of responses is possible in API Gateway. No direct method to import export rules for cross platforms, whereas API Gateway provides such functionality. API OpenAPI Spec 3.2 or Swagger. So if you want to move to another load balancer from another cloud service provider, you have to code those rules again. Whereas API Gateway, we can actually export and import the rules directly. ALB normally uses EC2 Lambda IP addresses as backend, whereas API Gateway integrates with any of the AWS services. Health checks are available on Application Load Balancer, whereas they are not available on API Gateway. API Gateway cannot periodically go and check its backend systems like ALB does. For ALB, it's paper idle as well. API Gateway, it's paper use. Let me get into a little bit more details into that. So API Gateway has a generous free tier, 1 million HTTP API calls, 1 million REST API calls, 1 million messages, and 750,000 connection minutes per month. Up to 12 months is available. Whereas ALB, new AWS customers can receive 750 hours per month shared between both classic and application load balancers. So if you're trying to do a POC, API Gateway can better cover you in free tier. Moving on to the use cases and scenarios where you should use. If you want to expose REST or WebSocket APIs with security, rate limiting, throttling, versioning, API Gateway is your solution. You have multiple microservices and need to route traffic efficiently based on URL paths or domains. ALB is the solution. You need to perform API transformations, request validation, response mapping, or developer usage plans. Guess it? It's API Gateway. You are simply routing a simple traffic to container CC2s with minimal logic. Then you can go ahead with application load balancer. Can we use them together? Of course we can. You can put an API gateway in front of an ALB or Lambda, depending on your architecture. So you can have API gateway, which can do the authentication, authorization, extensive mechanisms, and do some response request mappings. And then you do the distribution of automatic traffic distribution functionality to ALB, which will actually communicate further to the backend services. Hope this helps. If you have any queries, go ahead and comment. Subscribe to the channel.